Privilege to have as our moderator for this afternoon segment a man that certainly needs no introduction, I would hope, to this group, one of the most distinguished leaders of any Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections in the country, and recently paroled after 33 years of service in January of 2010. Terry Collins began his career with DRC in 1977 at Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, rose through the ranks to London Correctional, became warden at Lorraine Correctional, became warden at Southern Ohio Correctional, Ross Correctional, promoted to South Regional Director, then Deputy Director of Inspections, Assistant Director in 2005, and then was appointed by Governor Taft in 2006 to lead the department when another very distinguished DRC Director, Reggie Wilkinson, departed the scene. And Reggie, we're glad to see you with us today. It's a great tribute to the expertise and acumen of Director Collins that when Governor Strickland became our governor, he kept Director Collins in that position, and Director Collins was a very, very effective spokesperson for the department and really established a great rapport, I think, with both the Republicans and Democrats, and repeated a few certain basic truisms which over time are beginning to sink in. It takes time to get the message out that we really do, as he liked to always say, you folks in the legislature need to decide who we're incarcerating because they're really bad people and who we're incarcerating just because we're mad at them. And we've got to decide that because it has fiscal ramifications and public safety ramifications for the state. Director Collins is a member of all the various correctional organizations that are known to man, and I won't go through that whole list because it means very little except to those of you who already know those organizations. But he's a fine, fine gentleman. We miss him very much, though he was certainly replaced by an able and capable director in Director Moore. And Director Collins, it's great to see you back and losing so much weight. I told him this morning he's the incredible shrinking director, Terry Collins. I give you Terry Collins.
It's always a pleasure to be introduced by Senator Schatz, and I'm glad that finally somebody is listening. That took for me to retire for somebody to listen, but it's great always having Saturday and Sunday being every day. It's a pleasure to be here today to moderate a panel about criminal justice sanctions, resources, and treatment in the community, and we have some experts with us today who are on the lines each and every day dealing with the community in the various roles that they play, and I'll introduce them. We have to the far end Craig Tame. Craig is the law enforcement coordinator for the U.S. Attorney's Office, Northern District of Ohio. We have Jack Cameron, who is the executive director of the Ohio Empowerment Coalition. We have Gail Heller, who is the executive director of Choices, Eliminating Domestic Violence. We have William Denihan, who is the CEO of the Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Board of Cuyahoga County. We have Neil Tilow, who is the president and CEO of Talbert House. And we have Monda, DeWeese, who is the executive director of the SEPTA community-based correctional facility. So as you can see, we have an excellent panel of individuals who are going to discuss and talk about many of the things we've heard this morning. And I'm going to kind of keep the same format that we had earlier with Tom's group and the key indicators that we've had today about the revolving door. And I think one of the questions that was brought up in the previous panel that came in from the audience, and I would remind you that we will take your questions. They have little cards there. We'll take a lot of questions. They said they wanted the toughest questions you could bring forward. So we'll see if we can find those. But somebody asked about the revolving door in the last session. And it certainly appears to me that the revolving door problem not only presents a problem in the prison system, which I was fully aware of, but I also know it presents a problem at the community level in reference to resources, sanctions, and treatment. So I would pose to the panel in reference to the front end offender, those sentenced to probation but placed in the community-based correctional facility or halfway house as part of the sentence. What resources should we look for? What do you think is needed for treatment? What sanctions and what incentives do you see are needed to reduce crime, reduce recidivism, and therefore create a greater public safety? And I don't think it necessarily has to be from one of the providers of service, but from Craig and the law enforcement, what they see as potential sanctions or incentives and what they would see as resources. So I'll throw that question open. I'm not going to pick on anybody. I'll just let anybody pick up the mic that wants to pick up the mic, and we'll go from there.
You know, as we chatted before, my focus is primarily on law enforcement coordination, but over the years I've also gotten into kind of more comprehensive planning that involve reentry and prevention and what have you. But in this particular situation, I guess from a law enforcement perspective is that there's communication between probation and local law enforcement as to, you know, this particular individual was sent to probation and certain programming. He's at this risk level, he's at this danger level to the neighborhood community. They're aware of him. There's information shared between law enforcement and probation. And I don't think that's happening consistently now.
Right. Others? Neil?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Well, it seems to me that one of the issues we have is that many mental health and substance use providers don't see this clientele as their most favorite clientele to work with. And therefore, and with the limited money for indigent care, for non-Medicaid care in the behavioral health system, I think we're backing up quite a bit in terms of wait lists and things like that. So I think there should be more coordination and communication, certainly. I think the wait list, and I think just this, again, isn't a favored population, and that's going to be more true as we try to put more emphasis on the higher risk offenders. And if you're a mental health or drug and alcohol provider exclusively, you might be even less likely to take the higher risk offenders than you are to take the lower risk offenders, right? I mean, so the DUI offenders seem okay, and some others, but when you get into taking these offenders that we can have the most impact on, according to the research, I think folks are going to be less likely to want to take them. So it's going to be a significant problem going forward, I think.
I'd just like to piggyback on top of what Neil said about the not being a favorite population. You know, I think there's even prejudice among the mental health community of providers. You know, as much as I hate to say it, the staffs that have worked for me have said, "Oh, you know, we've got a forensic client, or we've got a client that just got out of prison," and you know, somebody'd roll their eyes. But you know, we have a responsibility to try to help people when they are released, and I think that we got to get more creative about how we address that issue. And you know, one of the problems is that a lot of the people that we serve, the most severely mentally disabled people that we serve, we consider them such a vulnerable population. They're vulnerable to a lot of exploitation. So when we get a client that's out of the prison system, it's sort of a red flag, and I think it makes it harder to serve them. But my personal experience has been that when you get a client that's been in the prison system and they have connections in their community, and I think that's the key. If they can get connected to something in their community so they're just not out there floundering, you have a much better chance of success. And I have also found that if you are willing to take that risk, that you can end up with a really loyal employee or volunteer and somebody who is extremely grateful for that opportunity, and that really good things can happen.
I think that the offenders that we serve are very much known to the court. The earlier panel talked about the fact that the individuals who come to CBCFs anyway, this isn't their first experience with the criminal justice system. They're known entities, and they've kind of ratcheted up the system before they come to us. One of the things in the report that we were given today talks a little bit about offenders still needing services, and I kind of address the fact that once they're released from a CBCF, they still need those community services. Well, you're changing a lifetime, a pattern of behavior that's not going to change in 40 days or 60 days or 120 days, or you're looking at kind of this longer range plan. And I know earlier we talked about the importance of being able to work with probation in a community-based corrections facility, because unfortunately our time frame with them is very short in a CBCF, and probation does in fact become our aftercare. So that partnership and that ability to work with that particular transition is very important to our success for the resident population we serve.
Well, I think this morning we've talked and focused so much on evidence-based work, and we need to really consider that when we're talking about this as well. We know that there's a lot of information and data out there that tells us what works with this particular population. whether it's folks who are using substances or folks who have mental illnesses. And if we focus on that, if we direct our resources in that way, we'll have a much better success, I think. And we also need to remember to communicate that information to the victims in these situations, because they want to know that there's something out there that's going to help change the behavior that's going to prevent them from being re-victimized in the future.
I think Gail brings up an excellent point, and I would like to ask her to maybe respond a little bit. We've talked about mental illness, we've talked about drug addiction, but we also know that a huge percentage of individuals entering the prison system have a long history of domestic violence. And I know when DRC's been looking at trying to do some things with domestic violence, it would appear to me that that same concept needs to be worked on more in the community to maybe deal with some of those issues of domestic violence, which can turn into assault, which can turn into felonious assault, which turns into murder, which turns into a whole lot of different things. Gail, could you maybe enlighten us a little more?
I agree totally with what you're saying. I think as we look at incidences of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, those don't necessarily end up being the crime of conviction for the individuals that we're going to see, especially these felonies 4s and 5s. They're going to be coming through the system with a conviction for something else. And so the assessment piece becomes absolutely critical so that we do have that in consideration when we're determining what happens to these individuals. Are they going to go to prison? Are they going to stay in the community? And then keeping in mind and working with the victim advocates in the community, that communication link, that coordination piece is critical to making sure that the individuals who have been victimized stay safe, so that there's safety plans in place. Because we know that if the treatment isn't directed in that way, and that's an area certainly that resources can be directed to, but if the treatment isn't working, isn't effective, we need to make sure that we're able to keep our victims safe.
I think I heard a couple times from this panel the word reentry. And I know I heard Tim talk about it earlier, and I heard Victor talk about it earlier. And we could probably spend the next 4 days talking about reentry. But I think it's extremely important that at least that concept is out there. And I was glad to hear the last panel talk about the results of a felony conviction, of what that does to the rest of your life in reference to collateral sanctions and reentry, because it does make a difference on recidivism. It does make a difference on people returning to prison. Let's focus a little bit on, since you're the experts in this area, we talk about this revolving door to prison system, and we send somebody off, and it sounds like it's really tough to send you off to prison. You're going to be there for 9 months, oftentimes only for a few days, and you're going to get some treatment there, but probably not going to get lots of treatment because you don't have time, as I think Monda talked about, time needed even in the programs in the community. But what do we do with these people? How do we reduce their recidivism? Those people who are doing 9 months, getting out of prison, got the stigma of a felony, got the stigma of ex-offender. What do we do with those people? Is it best to give them longer sentences? Is it better to have more supervision? Is it best to put them in transitional control? I'd like to hear your thoughts about what you believe some of that could be in reference to the revolving door. Bill?
Thanks, Terry. Representing Cuyahoga County, we find is as much what we do on the front end that has to do what happens at the back end. And in terms of revolving door, the question, 9 months or 36 months, 9 months with nothing creates a whole high amount of recidivism. My viewpoint and our evidence, which is shown out in this report and what we've done locally, is behavioral health programs work, and having 36 months of treatment with perhaps threat of probation, my evidence tells us that it's cheaper, and it significantly reduces recidivism. But it's not just reentry, it's the impact before they get there with the CIT program, reducing arrest, taken to treatment, diffusing a situation. The jail liaisons reduces the time to court, drug courts, mental health courts, and the opportunities for treatment as opposed to incarceration
for those first-time nonviolent drug users, in which one of the panelists, I believe, correctly identified as we're treating them how to be criminals and career criminals. And if we provide the opportunity with behavioral health treatment, we're finding out that we can and do reduce recidivism. On 3 programs that was originally funded a DRC going on, I think, 7 years ago, we have recidivism rates as low as 20%, 10%, and 5%. Now, that's extraordinary, but it's also a very low amount of people. And it shows, number one, it does work, and number two, that it is a safety issue in that it's reducing the amount of crimes, but we're only perhaps treating maybe about 165 or 175 people out of a potential 900 or 1,000 in our community. So I really believe this whole business of this discussion is a community discussion, not just law enforcement, not just probation, not just the prison. It's the entire community, and we're finding that once we do all that and come together, that there are extraordinary benefits. For example, making a commitment to hire the people that do have felony records within our own systems. Everybody represents a system in this room today. And if we all made a commitment to hire somebody, Chief of Police Mike McGrath in Cleveland hired a felon to work in his police department in his unit. That is a signal that all of us somehow can help address that, and look at a person that's a felon and see them have a job and watch them go forward. So my view is that we want to reduce recidivism and reduce the number of folks going back to the system. Behavioral health is a key, and treatment involves as whatever way we could get treatment as opposed to incarceration, whether it's shortened or at all on the low-risk offenders. I think we've proven in this state it does work.
Yeah, comments, Neil?
Terry, you mentioned, these 9-month offenders and what are we going to do with them? And obviously, one really straightforward, easy solution is make sure every 9-month offender does 3 of those months in transitional control. Now, transitional control is essentially a work release program. And if someone's going to be out in 90 days, if they're for a felony 4 or 5, I see no logical reason for 100% of those people not to be released into transitional control. It would be a pretty straightforward process to say everybody's going to get that. It's just the way it is. Anybody who's doing a year or 18 months or less, whatever, is going to get that automatically. And it would, right now, I think about 40% of the TCs, some I might know from DRC, about 40% of all the TCs are vetoed by the judges and not allowing them to come out to transitional control. And I understand that judges have concerns, but maybe if we flip-flopped it and said, going forward, we're going to have this and not deal with the existing people sentenced under different processes could go through a different kind of transitional control. When they serve a shorter sentence, it's an automatic part of the DRC rules. They are still considered inmates. They still have to be accounted for all the time, but they get to go to work, they get to pay taxes, they get to support their family, they get to go into treatment. It seems like it's the best of all worlds. So it's something I would advocate very strongly that the state consider doing, having an automatic for that last 90 days or so, maybe 120 days, depending. But if it's a 9-month sentence, a third of it being done in a community setting where they are considered an inmate non-work release would be a great solution to me.
So step down out of prison in the community rather than just throwing you out the door and
Sure,
saying.
everybody needs some sort of reentry plan, and that would be it for them. And of course, we need to develop some other reentry services for other offenders, but that's a pretty easy one for the short-termers.
I think it was said this morning, and maybe Gail or Jack or Craig would respond to this. I know it was said this morning that most people in Ohio don't think about the number of people leaving prison not under supervision. I know when I give community presentations and say that roughly 50% of the people who leave the state prison system have no supervision, everybody kind of goes, because they think everybody's got a parole officer with them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, sleep with them and everything else. Some people live in fantasy lands. So how do the victims advocates and the police, what's your thoughts about that? Should there be some change to that? Would you advocate some other means to deal with that group?
You know, it's actually interesting. 10 years ago, to even talk about Cuyahoga County was getting about 6,000 or 7,000 re-entering felons every year, and I know Director Wilkinson and yourself know that better than anyone. But it was almost like a dirty secret that only grassroots community programs would develop intervention programs or helpful programs for them. I think this year we're getting 700,000. About 50% of them are not on post-release control. I think 10% or something like that are secured threat group level, which are the dangerous ones. You guys know as well as I do. But I still harken back to what I was saying before. We're doing comprehensive planning. Bill's the chair of our reentry committee in Cuyahoga County. Director Wilkinson was on it before. Carlton Moore's worked on us. You worked with it, Director. That piece is fine, but in terms of victim advocates and the police, the level of information sharing, in fact, we're going to set up a meeting and talk about some of this stuff, shared between, kind of system-wide between adult parole authority and local police departments as to the high-risk returning offenders is, I still think, inconsistent and could be improved upon, that would assure not only the safety of the victims in the community, but also would increase accountability for the returning offenders, that they're being watched, that somebody's keeping an eye on them. That hasn't happened consistently now, and I think that would go a long way in improving things.
I agree with that 100%. I think that communication is one of the areas, no matter what system we're talking about, where there's significant improvement needed. And whether it's between individuals that are working in victim advocates and law enforcement, as you said, between folks that are probation officers, between people that are operating in programs within the community that house offenders, I think we all could do a better job talking to each other more and sharing that good information so that not just victims are safe, but our communities are safer in general.
Anybody else have any comments about that? I mean, I guess I could pose a question that research probably shows that those who have no supervision certainly don't revocate as much as those who have supervision. So maybe you increase your prison population by putting more people under supervision. I mean, I know our research people have kind of looked at that, because I had questions when I was the director about, is our supervision good, bad, or indifferent? Are people coming back to prison more for new felonies without supervision than they were with supervision? So it's a two-sided coin, but I think most people don't understand that people are not supervising this.
According to the data that was collected by the Justice Center group, the recidivism rate's been about consistent 39%, at least for the years 2000, 2005. And the percentage of new crime rate 3 years is 30%. So, I mean, I always thought about your point. So you watch a kid more closely in the juvenile court. So you watch an adult who's gotten out of, you watch them more closely, you're going to technically violate them. But I think you got to factor in all those things about you don't technically violate it necessarily because you're supervising more closely. You know, Richland County is doing some real interesting work in this whole area where adult parole's working closely with local police. And I think they do a good job of monitoring. And I don't have the data in front of them in terms of recidivism rate, but I think they've been pretty effective.
I think some counties are doing reentry courts, particularly Richland County. I know Cuyahoga County is working on that. Well, let's turn to the admission criteria for diversion programs, which affects all of you because that's how you get people in your programs. Could you share some of your thoughts on, I mean, we've seen this morning there's really no criteria that's strictly used. It's kind of depends on the judge, depends on the county, depends on the part of the state. Let's hear some ideas from you on what you would see as that ideal person that you should have and what criteria should be used to place them into your programs.
I won't give you an ideal person, but I tell you, we seem to do a real good job incarcerating first-time nonviolent offenders. And I think that we need to look at the possibility of providing the option of treatment versus incarceration. But one of the things that really works, no matter what type of felon it is when we have the opportunity to go into prison prior to release and develop a relationship with that individual and have the ability to provide mental health or alcohol and substance abuse treatment as they come out. That has been extraordinarily effective, and doesn't matter what felony level it is, it works.
The program that I work with serves 14 southeastern Ohio counties, so we have 14 different courts that send to us. So we have a lot of variety of sentencing practices that we have to kind of contend with, and I think the opportunity to have a uniform screening risk and assessment tool that they can actually embrace will be important. We've been using the LSIR for years, and the judges are kind of all over the place with that in terms of whether or not they support it or accept the premise of it. I think we've got a big marketing situation to deal with the ORAS and the judiciary, and it's one that I know the department's going to be working on, and certainly CBCF directors will be there as well. But if we're using a uniform standard risk assessment tool, we've got to get the buy-in from the judges in order for us to be able to make the process be effective, because we have a broad criteria for accepting people into a community-based corrections facility. There are certain exclusions for offenders that cannot come in, but beyond that, it is at the discretion of the judge. And whether they're low risk or moderate risk or high risk, if the judge is looking for a place for them to go, and again, we talk a little bit about whether or not there's substance abuse or mental health counseling available in the communities, that certainly impacts the decision about where they go. So getting that buy-in and that education piece to the judges is very critical, and I know is next on the horizon for all of us.
Neil?
Yeah, I would agree completely that I think some sort of standardized risk assessment tool, every judge I've ever met or dealt with is interested in doing the right thing, and the more information they have, usually the better decision they can make. And I think it will take a while to get buy-in on ORAS, but if we give it to the judges before sentencing, as part of the PSI, as part of their consideration, I think better decisions will get made, and I think then we can show the data what does happen. The reality is that too much treatment is as bad as not enough, and that's true in the justice system, if there really is a system, not just a process, because it doesn't seem to me there's always really a systemic approach here, much like healthcare. If you have someone who is sick with cancer and the doctor says, I think I'm going to give you radiation, when the data doesn't support radiation, the data supports chemotherapy or surgery, but this doctor's a radiologist, so he's going to give radiation because that's what he believes in or he or she knows. That's not the right approach to medicine, and it's certainly not the right approach to treating this group of offenders or any group of offenders. So I think if folks had better data on the front end, we're more certain of not doing harm, we're certain of getting the best outcome. Again, most judges, most professionals want to reduce recidivism. I mean, that's not surprising. And if we could tell them how they could do a better job doing that, I think we can make a pretty convincing argument that that's the right thing to do, that we do have care options for drug and alcohol and mental health, that we do have the right kind of supervision, and that this assessment tool, the ORAS, can give us a lot of that information. And again, back to, I kind of paraphrase what you said, Terry, how Bill introduced you, Senator Seitz introduced you. I want to incarcerate people I'm afraid of, not mad at. And I think most judges are that way too. I think most of us as citizens want to be protected in the community. And I think someone earlier took it off the table in the earlier panel, said, well, the ones and twos, let's just say if you've committed a crime of violence, we're really not talking about you here today, and you probably deserve to be incarcerated. And I can't imagine if I asked for a raise of hands that anybody in the room would say they'd feel too different than that. But these other folks who are the 3, 4s, and 5s, especially, let's really try to find better care options for them, but let's make sure that we have the data to support it.
Other comments from the panel?